Hi, my name is Christy, and this is the American Chinese Food Show where we analyze historical artifacts like vintage menus, recipe books, photographs, and text to tell the story of American Chinese food. If you have to imagine the person who wrote the oldest English language Chinese cookbook ever published, what kind of person comes to mind? A culinary expert? A researcher of fine things about China? No, it was a 50-year-old divorcee living in Chicago with her mother and her 20-year-old son. Her name is Jessie Louise Nolton. At the time, Mrs. Nolton was working in the editorial department of the Inter-Ocean, a prominent paper that catered to well-to-do subscribers and businessmen. Her focus was on women's health and beauty. She wrote for the column called Madame Helly. Published in 1911, Mrs. Nolton's 135-page book, called Chinese Cookery in the Home Kitchen, was written with the intention of introducing Chinese cooking to white, middle-class American readers. But why her? What was Mrs. Nolton's connection to Chinese food? Here's how Chin Foyne, a restaurateur active in Chicago at the turn of the century we covered in a previous episode, comes into play. Inter-Ocean, the paper Mrs. Nolton worked at, occupied a building at the corner of West Madison and South Dearborn Streets inside the Loop, and was only a 10-block walk from the edge of Chicago's original Chinatown. Chin Foyne's granddaughter Nancy Wang claims Mrs. Nolton took some of the recipes from Chin's cook, but never explicitly references Chin by name. Instead of claiming to be the author of this cookbook, Mrs. Nolton decided to put "edited by Jessie Louise Nolton" on the title page. She made it clear these recipes came from Chinese restaurants and cooks, saying, "It is for use in the home kitchen that this little volume has been compiled, carefully from the recipes given by Chinese cooks of great reputation, and clearly as possible, so the amateur cannot fail to meet with success. The best of the known methods of Chinese cookery are elaborated here." In the section talking about cooking rice, she even included a direct quote with broken English. To quote from one Chinese cook, "Water boil him very fast, shake him too much so cannot burn." Mrs. Nolton separated the cookbook into sections easy to follow. It began with a special ingredients section. She urged readers to get the ingredients since it is not a difficult matter to make the necessary purchases from Chinese merchants found in almost every city of any size in America. Let's take a look and see if we can figure out what they are. Chinese potatoes, a small Chinese vegetable which is the root or tuber of a water plant. The flavor is similar to sugarcane when raw. I think this is a good tip here. A potato that you can eat raw and it tastes kind of sweet. I'm going to say this is water chestnut. The name water chestnut comes from the fact that it resembles a chestnut in shape and coloring, but it's actually not a nut at all. It is an aquatic vegetable that grows in freshwater marshes. It's interesting that this is the first ingredient introduced in the book, since water chestnut is not a widely used ingredient in Chinese cooking at all. It's the first because over half of the dishes covered in this book are chop suey, and water chestnut is indispensable in chop suey dishes. Chinese mushrooms. This is a no-brainer, shiitake mushroom. Mrs. Nolton also teaches how to rehydrate dry shiitake mushrooms. I personally rehydrate a lot, slow cook them in a stew with soy sauce, oyster sauce, and sugar, and freeze them, so I always have some in the freezer for emergency use. Chinese beans. This is mung beans. Mrs. Nolton teaches readers how to grow bean sprouts here. Sprouts will be large enough to use in 4 or 5 days and will take the place of celery in the chop suey. I think many kids who grew up in Asia had this as a homework assignment at some point. In fact, I still sometimes grow them at home. Chinese seasoning sauce. A rather salty sauce with a sort of meaty flavor. It is a necessity in preparing Chinese dishes to obtain the peculiar flavor which makes the chief charm of the dish. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this is soy sauce. It's also confirmed later in the book. A small pot of soy, CU or Seagao, or actually it's called xi yao in Cantonese, as the seasoning sauce is variously called, should also be at each place for use if further seasoning of the food is desired. And lastly, Chinese flavoring sauce, a sauce which is somewhat like molasses in appearance and is used in most of the chop suey dishes. This could be dark soy sauce, but I believe Chinese flavoring sauce is likely oyster sauce because in the recipe it's used to mix with cornstarch to make gravy for chop suey. Dark soy sauce doesn't thicken and oyster sauce does. The recipes started with Chinese methods of cooking rice. On point, what is Cantonese food without steamed rice? Then we have chop suey, different variations of chicken chop suey with giblets and green ginger, pineapple, veal, green peppers, lamb, beef, and duck. There might be some truth in Mrs. Nolton getting the recipes from Chin Foy's chefs. Take a look at the resemblance with his restaurant menu. After chop suey, we have noodle dishes like chow mein, wo mein, yak mein, then a few variations of egg foo young. At last, we have some complicated dishes like Chinese cured pork, Chinese roast pig, boned squab, shark's fin, bird's nest soup, and the recipes end with salads. My hope is to cover more recipe books in this channel in the future. I think it will be interesting to use the common dish of chop suey as the benchmark to see how each recipe book varies in its instructions. In Mrs. Nolton's Chinese Cookery in the Home Kitchen from 1911, you first braise pork in a wok until lightly browned. Add onions and chicken stock, shiitake mushroom, water chestnuts, bean sprouts, and a bit of soy sauce. Cover and slow cook for 12 minutes. Add gravy made of cornstarch and oyster sauce to finish the dish. I have never had chop suey made in the early 1900s, but if I were to make one myself today, the steps will largely be very similar, especially since cooking time would be adjusted due to improved kitchenware. So for example, I wouldn't cook the meat for 12 minutes, that's way too long. Maybe like 2 minutes. I also would velvet the meat or 早咬 in Cantonese or 过油 in Mandarin, meaning passing through oil. The way you do it is you first marinate the pork with soy sauce, sugar, white pepper, and cornstarch, and quickly cook them in hot oil for a minute or two. So the meat is still raw inside, and you set them aside and put the meat back to the dish after all the vegetables are cooked. This way moisture is kept in the meat and it comes out very velvety. I actually think Mrs. Nolton's recipe of chop suey is a truthful representation on how to make this dish or like how to make any Cantonese stir fry. It is so much better than many blog posts I see today that don't even do like a slurry at the end of the stir fry dish. Sure, some of Mrs. Nolton's recipes for the complicated ones like roast pig and shark's fin soup are overly simplified, more like a description of what the dish is. But there are also some insider tips like how you're never supposed to pour liquid seasoning like stock or cooking wine directly on top of the food in the middle, but instead pour around the rim of the wok to make sure it's distributed evenly. This shows Mrs. Nolton talked to at least a cook that was willing to share his skills. She also introduced to her readers the wok. Of course, she didn't really call it the wok. The Chinese chop suey kettle is made of steel with a narrow rounded base and a flaring rim, and with small handles riveted on two sides of the rim. Pretty advanced stuff. After the recipes, there is a section on how to decorate for a Chinese luncheon, such as using colors yellow and red. At the end, we have sample menus that show how meals are served in the Chinese style with tea and preserved fruits. These two sections were probably particularly practical for her readers who were middle-class social ladies in the Midwest hosting meals at their home. The thing I like about this little cookbook is not only how it's the first cookbook playing a groundbreaking role to bring Chinese food into American homes, it champions Chinese food. Mrs. Nolton wrote, "The favorite dishes of the Orient are rapidly becoming the favorite dishes of the Occident." This was during a time when anti-Chinese sentiment was still very, very strong. Instead of feeding into the fear or falling into stereotypes, she took good care to introduce her audience to Chinese food with not just basic chop suey, but more refined dishes. For that, I'm grateful. You can find a link to the cookbook in the description below. Next episode, we will try recreating a dish from this cookbook. If you like our content, subscribe to our channel. See you soon!